So I was watching this from Constantine while he's off the fence about Israel's war, and he was trying to make a lot of logical points that I think should be explored a bit more because some of them don't actually make sense. So I wanted to do a first review of a video. I've never done this before, but I'm going to comment on some of the points that he's making about why he's off the fence about Israel. Let's see how we go.
Principle thinking about the conflict. First, the easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think. For example, if we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible, because on a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory, which shook the world's dominant superpower to its very core, we see that 2,977 people were killed in a country of 285 million people. On October 7th, approximately 1,200 people were killed in a country of just 9 million people. Some keep calling October 7th Israel's 9/11. That isn't remotely true. If October 7th was Israel 9/11, on a per capita basis, only 100 people would have been killed. In other words, October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11.
So the point he's trying to make over here is that October 7 is much worse than 9/11 because when you look at it per capita basis, Israel is a small country compared to the US. And so imagine if this happened to you in the US where it's 12 times 9/11. But at the same time, you can make the same logic in the opposite way, i.e., let's take, for example, the killings that Israel does towards the Palestinians. Let's take Gaza for this example. In 2008, 1,400 people were killed by the Israelis. With a population in Gaza of 2.1 million, if we were to equate this to the US, that would equal to 190,000 people. In 2014, about 2,100 people were killed, mostly civilians, out of a population of 2.1 million in Gaza, which would equate to, if we're comparing to the US, 285,000 people. Now, imagine a foreign country has killed 285,000 of your civilians in less than a year, and it keeps doing this every single year. In 2022 and 2021, the number was reduced in terms of the killings to, I think, 290 people, civilians killed, mostly civilians, which would equate to 39,000 people if we're comparing it to the US. Imagine if thousands of people were being killed in your country, and not just to look at it from a death perspective, but even from Israel has this policy of demolishing housing that are for Palestinians, whether that's in East Jerusalem or whether that's in West Bank. There was 1,300 people that were made homeless in 1 year in West Bank, which is a population of 2.9 million, which if you're comparing it to the US, that's 127,000 people that were made homeless by demolishing their houses by a foreign country. So imagine if like Mexico came in and just demolished 127,000 people's homes, and we were just kind of fine with it. So when you because context is important, which is the point he's trying to make, let's put in the context over here. And so when you put in the context of having a specific foreign country do this to your people, there's going to be some kind of reaction. And I guess the question is, what is that reaction that someone would have? And I'm not saying 7 October was justified. Thinking about you and where you are in your country, what would you react to if that was happening around you? If you had, your parents being killed, your son being killed, your daughter being killed, your uncle being killed, there's whole families that are terminated in Gaza. How would you react to that? Not saying that the way you react would be 7 October, but what is it? Like, have a think about how you would react to that. And, in the same argument, how would people that have nothing to do with the killings of Palestinians in Israel, when they get killed, how would they react to that at the same time? Hate creates hate. It's a cliche statement, but that's the way it works.
And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since. So the obvious question is, if thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America react? Would this...
That's exactly what Israel does, and what Hamas has done it's interesting that he is showcasing just one angle of that because he's already making this something happen to Israel out of nowhere. And so, what is the reaction that a country like Israel should have? Now, of course, the country has to take care of its citizens, it has to secure its borders. There has to be a reaction to an attack on its civilians.
Still be a Mexico to speak of. Whatever your view of the history of this conflict, I believe the logic of this is impenetrable. However, there are some persuasive arguments from the anti-Israel camp which are aimed at contextualizing October 7th. Let's look at them. Number one, history did not start on October 7th. The crux of this argument, when broken down to its central premise, is that the state of Israel is illegitimate. In this conception, Israel
Doesn't have to mean like that. So some people will view Israel, the state of Israel, or the creation of that, to be illegitimate. And when people say it didn't start October 7th, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It means there were other events that were happening throughout the last decades of kind of putting people, subjugating people to extreme violence, whether that's the settler violence that we see in West Bank, where they're able to actually go and demolish houses or burn houses or kill people, or it's, as there's a lot of doctors that go to Gaza, and the thing they come back with, or even West Bank, is how many kids get shot, either headshots or kind of in the knees to make them paralyzed. So when that happens to a society, what do you create? I love the argument all the times where people show, what they're teaching in schools in Gaza and say, like, look, they're trying to create a lot of hate in those places against the Israelis or Jewish people. But the other argument is, do they need even schools when they have their whole families being killed and they have their whole housing being demolished? And I think that's the thing that most people forget, is that when you're facing extermination on a large scale, and when there are people throwing bombs on top of you, you're not going to come sit down and think logically, but that was, a reaction to Hamas. You're going to think, who has that gun in front of me is the monster and the evil, obviously. Who's throwing these bombs and creating the firestorms that we see is the evil, right? It's very interesting for us outside of that to kind of bring the logic to such a situation of that. Those people must understand that it's not Israel's fault that this is happening. It's Hamas's fault. But that's just not realistic for people that are actually in there experiencing those things.
if they make sense. The first argument, whose central premise is that Israel is illegitimate, seems to be at the core of every debate. It feels reasonable and logical to many people to contextualize Israel's response to October 7th in this way. After all, if Israel was created through illegitimate means, it puts the discussion on an entirely different footing, doesn't it? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. Again, let's think from first principles. If we believe every pro-Palestinian claim and accept that Israel was created through the forced placement of European Jews in a foreign land by Western powers, we must look for a comparable situation in which a country was created through some form of displacement of the native population. Most of you live in such a country. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all the products of invasion, colonization, and brutal conquest.
It's really interesting. It's a good point. This has happened quite a few times to a lot of countries. So imagine if when the Europeans came to America and killed off so many Native Americans in a very barbaric ways. A lot of them died because of disease also. Imagine if those Native Americans were resisting, you would say, why are they resisting? They're so barbaric. And when the Native Americans resisted, they did so in also barbaric ways, because when they go, any community, when they go through extreme situations where families are being terminated and, you've got your uncle, father, brother, son dying, you're pushed to some extreme reactions. And that's what happened also with the Native Americans. But imagine when the Native Americans react to what's happening or how they're being subjugated by the Europeans that are coming in, you'd call them racist. They hate white Europeans. Why do they hate us so much? That's a crazy question to say. The fact that they're resisting or they're fighting the Europeans doesn't mean that they're racist towards them. They're just kind of reacting to the situation that they're put in. It's not, they didn't start by going to another place. That someone came to their place and caused that mayhem. So it's an interesting point. But that's not the point that he's making, but yeah.
If you go back far enough, so is almost every other country in the world. Like it or not, Israel exists. It's home to over 9 million people. The idea that they would, could, or should accept the destruction of what is now their country is absurd. The United States government would.
This point I agree with him on. And I think this is one of the biggest issues, that there's many things that are stopping peace and for those two communities, the Israelis and Palestinians, to come together. From the Palestinian side, and from the, Netanyahu has come out so many times to say, I've been playing a game of trying to not create a state for the Palestinians, even though I'm negotiating. But from the Palestinian side, there is a lot of resentment, understandably, as if you feel like you lose something and someone else gains that over you, you will have resentment. But this idea of going back to 1948, before the Jewish state, is such a far away from reality of what's possible. It stops us from moving forward, and coming together and creating that peace. And so we need to, not we, but they, the Palestinians, need to accept the fact that Israel is here. It will always be here. And we need to work towards working together and bringing those communities together. And terrible things have happened, and we need to move forward from that. The problem is that terrible things continue to be happening, and that's the issue from the Israeli side.
Would not tolerate missile strikes and terrorist rampages from Native American reservations. Neither would any government of any country under any circumstances. Peace in the Middle East will not be achieved by attempting to undo many decades of history. The second argument centers on the idea that October 7th was a response to Israeli occupation and brutality. This, again, seems reasonable to many people. After all, what would it take for you to behave the way Hamas did on October 7th? The problem with this argument is that what happened on October 7th was not an attempt to weaken Israel militarily. It was not an attempt to break Hamas militants out of Israeli jails. It was not an attack on the Israeli Defense Force.
So this is questionable, because he's right in that it seemed like an attack on just creating mayhem and creating terror. But at the same time, they did kill a lot of soldiers, whether they were actual soldiers or conscripted before to in the military, the reserves. But they did eliminate a lot of those. But what they did also with that is totally insane and messed up and wrong. Now, let's just continue.
It was not a prison breakout, as some people like to describe it, because when people break out of a prison, they don't normally head to the nearest town and start massacring women and children. October 7th was, by design and implementation, a terrorist attack. Its purpose was to slaughter civilians, terrify Israeli society, and nothing else. This was not an act of resistance. It was an act of terrorism, which is why Israel had to react to it in the manner that it has, and why any other country would have done the same. The third argument is that Israel is killing.
The argument is not whether Israel should have reacted to it or not, although that is what some people are arguing about. It's the way that their reaction is occurring. The fact that when 9/11 happened, America didn't straight away start bombing everything all around it. They kind of went into a strategy of how to go after Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, and I think the way, the method of the reaction of just demolishing the whole place, pretty much. I mean, imagine, how would people think if 90% of your population were displaced, essentially becoming homeless in a matter of a year? 90%. That's a big number. Imagine applying that in the US. 90% of your people, going back to his first logic, 90% of your people were being made homeless. Add that to the thousands and thousands of people being killed from that foreign country, equates to a lot of hate and anger, which makes you blind, but kind of makes you move with a lot of energy and focus. Unfortunately, led to all of those events.
Civilians. This is the one claim made by the anti-Israel side that is undeniably true. However, this is an example of the emotive but irrelevant context I mentioned earlier. Civilians are always killed in war. The question is not whether they're being killed, but who bears responsibility for their deaths and who can stop the killing. Again, applying first principles thinking, we must reach for a comparable example.
Well, this is the argument that's saying that Hamas is responsible for the killing. Hamas did something that warranted a reaction from Israel. How Israel chooses to react to such an event is Israel's choice. It could go and kill the leadership, for example, which is what it has done for the first part of its attack on Hezbollah. And we understand now that they are capable. They have the military and intelligence capability to go after the leadership. Or the other choice is just demolish the whole place and drop 2,000-pound bombs on and residential areas. And so you're saying, but they had to react to military activity in the area. Again, they have one of the most advanced militaries in the world, and they're capable of targeting specific targets instead of dropping 2,000-pound bombs in areas that are filled with people, which is obviously from the get-go, they know is going to kill a lot of civilians, even though maybe they're going to hit one or two military personnel. Then it goes back to, Hamas can just end this by giving back the hostages. It's very clear that even if they gave the hostages back, which I wish they would do, and I hope they would do, and I hope all the hostages go back, that would not change anything, because the objective of Israel is not to bring, the main primary objective is not to bring back the hostages. That's a secondary objective. The main objective is trying to eliminate and eradicate Hamas, which is going to be very difficult to do for the people, because it's not just the military Hamas, it's the idea of supporting Hamas. And when you have so many of your people being killed, again, you're not going to think about the logic of how Hamas actually created this. You're going to think about who's dropping the bombs and who's shooting at my kids in that moment. That's evil. That is where the problem is.
There is no exact equivalent that comes to mind, but there is some useful context we can consider. Hamas has repeatedly stated that given the opportunity, they will repeat the October 7th attacks again and again and again. While this may seem shocking to us in the West, it makes perfect sense given that Hamas believes Israel is illegitimate and would like to see it gone. This means that unless Israel destroys or degrades their ability to carry out their threats, it is likely to experience more terrorist attacks again and again. Does anyone seriously believe that any government of any country anywhere in the world would or could react to something like 12 9/11s in one day and the threat of more to follow as many times as possible with anything other than all-out war? And who can end?
But that's the same argument. Do you expect any people that have faced thousands of deaths to not react to the killings that are happening? Can any society where 90% of their people being displaced, being homeless, not react to what's happening? There's about 500 or 700 children a year in Israeli prisons who are either don't have anything against them, so they're locked up without a reason, or the reason is that they threw stones at the soldiers. And some of these children are there for 4 years, 5 years. So what kind of society would accept that? That's not justifying what Hamas did, but it's the same question, because the questions that he's asking is, how would any country not respond to any kind of attack like that? But he's not looking at it from the other way. How would any society not react to decades of attacks like that? It's the same logic. Unless you see one superior over the other, i.e., they are good, all of them are good, and all of them are evil, and so it doesn't matter how they would react. It's more of a how would Israel react? And there's going to be good in Israel, there's going to be evil in Israel, and there's going to be good in that society, and there's going to be evil in that society.
The killing. Well, theoretically, Israel could, of course, but for the reason we just discussed, they can't, won't, and shouldn't. That leaves Hamas, who could have returned the hostages and surrendered the people who took them. What is more, they could hide their civilians in the vast network of tunnels they've built to reduce casualties. Instead,
Israel's dropping 2,000-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs. These are dummy bombs that don't go after a target. They're just dropped that kind of, go through the tunnels and kind of demolish the tunnels. So even if they put the civilians there, they're going to die.
Instead, they refuse to build bomb shelters and do everything they can to maximize civilian casualties. That's not my opinion. It's something Hamas are themselves proud of. A senior spokesman for the group, Sami Abu Zuhri, gave an interview on Palestinian station Al-Aqsa TV the last time this conflict flared up. The policy of people confronting Israeli warplanes with their bare chests in order to protect their homes has proven effective against the occupation, he said. We in Hamas call upon our people to adopt this policy in order to protect Palestinian homes. So yes, the deaths of civilians are tragic.
And this is the thing, the Hamas leadership is terrible for the Palestinians. And so that's what Israel should go after, instead of not just killing Hamas, but punishing the people. There's no other way to kind of explain this. If you make 90% of the people of of the whole country homeless, if you stop water, energy, food, medicine to enter, which results in children having to be amputated but without anesthetic. Imagine as a father, you're having to tell your child, "We're going to have to chop off your leg," but there's no anesthetic. Um, who do you think the evil is for them, their experience of what's happening to them at that moment? And do you think that who is doing that is not collectively punishing the community, or do you think because a lot of the argument a lot of times is should Israel react? Is it justified or should it not? It's like there's so many options of how to react to an attack, and to say that this is the best option with that is not punishing the whole community is questionable.
In a modern world where you can fill your social media feed with gruesome footage, that tragedy can be broadcast straight into your home 24/7. But the responsibility for their deaths is entirely with Hamas, and the failure to put a stop to the killing is theirs and theirs alone.
And by the same logic, the other side can say the same thing. Uh, the reason why 7 October happened is because of X, Y, Z, and so it lies within Israel. Do you see? You can just flip whatever logic is being applied here can be flipped to the other side, and used in that way.
Which brings us to the final argument. Israel's attacks are indiscriminate and designed to inflict civilian casualties. This is actually the simplest argument of the four to address because it is an empirical matter. The war in Gaza is not the first conflict in human history. We can compare the ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in this war to others. What happens when we do? Historically, urban warfare operations result in a casualty ratio of 9 civilians for every 1 enemy fighter killed. In Gaza, it is 2 to 1. In other words, despite the deliberate attempts by Hamas to increase the number of civilian casualties, Israel has been extraordinarily successful in reducing them. This doesn't mean that there won't be.
And that's a good point. Israel can kill more civilians if it wanted to. It has the capability. Obviously, there's a certain line whereby the community won't allow Israel to kind of go beyond, and all people are saying, really? Is there a line? But let's say, if Israel nukes the place, that would be a line that, the whole world wouldn't accept. But at the same time, that's just one data point that you are comparing, which is deaths. There's so many other things like, demolishing, I think more than 50% of buildings in Gaza are gone. Imagine if 50% of the buildings in a country are gone, 90% of people are displaced, i.e. they're homeless now. Imagine a whole country, 90% are displaced. I think it's very hard to compare those figures with any recent conflict that has created that. I mean, just the most recent, well, the recent conflict that we are facing right now is the Russia-Ukraine war. You can say that's not an urban conflict, although there is some conflict in cities. And I think there's been only 500 children that were killed over 2 years compared to, I think it is 10 times that with the Palestine-Israel conflict in less than a year. So there's a lot of different comparisons that you can use to make whatever point that you're trying to make. But in terms of civilian deaths, yes, it could be worse. For sure, there has been other conflicts that are worse. But when you look at all the other data points, it's pretty one of the worst conflicts.
Be incidents in which innocent Palestinians are killed, and, as in any war, there will likely be war crimes committed by both sides. But overall, the numbers don't lie. If you need further evidence that claims of Israel's indiscriminate attacks are nonsense, just look at the way various commentators reacted to what has been dubbed Operation Grim Reaper. Thousands of Hezbollah pages were rigged with explosives and then detonated simultaneously, killing and injuring thousands of terrorists and a small number of bystanders. The pages in question were not picked at random. Israel specifically selected a batch of senior Hezbollah operatives. And still, people like Hamza Yusuf, Scotland's former First Minister, complain about Israel's indiscriminate attacks. This was, definitionally, the most precise targeted and surgical large-scale anti-terrorist operation in human history.
And this shows again that Israel has the intelligence capability and the sophistication to kill off the leadership instead of just making whole neighborhoods into parking lots. And I do agree that, look, you got to admit that what Israel did there with the walkie-talkies and pagers was as targeted as it can be with going after an enemy that you're fighting. But the example he's giving that some people still um, still negatively reacted to that, and so you cannot really have an argument with the other side. That's just one example of someone, and there's many that agree with what Hamza Yusuf said, and there's many that disagree with what Hamza Yusuf said. It is very hard to find people that are looking at this from an unbiased way because there's a lot of emotions there, but I'm not sure I get the point.
In summary, I've engaged with an open mind and in good faith with all the anti-Israel arguments presented to me over the last year. On balance, I regard them as disingenuous, irrelevant, and designed to pull at my heartstrings in order to obscure the harsh reality of this conflict. We would respond exactly the way that Israel has. The only difference is we would do so with the support of every member of the international community, while Israel has to fight not only the terrorists who want to wipe them off the map, but Western apologists for those terrorists as well. If you enjoy these...
Yeah, it's interesting that the approach that he's coming at this is, if we were living in a country, if this happened to the UK, we would react the same way. But he's not looking at how would a country, a society that is being subjugated to this react to that. You know, how did the Native Americans react to Europeans coming in, or other scenarios where there was a people there, and there was kind of a mass immigration of another people that was kind of creating difficult conditions for those people. I mean, imagine if people came to the UK and wanted to kind of, I guess, create their own thing over here. Just the mass immigration debate that we're having right now in the UK has caused violence, and that hasn't nowhere near of what happened in the 1920s and 30s in that region is happening over here today. But he didn't flip it the other way. He was looking at it from just one angle of how would we react to that, instead of how would that community also react to such a foreign force. The issue I have with all of this, and I think we're all guilty of this, is that we've made this whole suffering and trauma that a lot of people are going through from both sides, but there's a lot of trauma that's happening right now at this moment with, you know, with so many people being homeless, not having access to food or water or medicine. We've made it into almost of a game, a charade, almost like whose team are you on? And I'm not saying that's what Constantine is doing here. I think we've a lot of us have done that. We've made it into just a topic to discuss over dinner or over our break to see a debate about this topic that's happening in a faraway place. We have, instead of connecting and understanding the experiences of what's happening on the ground, we are just now discussing thoughts and ideas so distant from the experience of those people. And that's the issue. I mean, dialogue is great, but when we're just having a conversation for the sake of having a conversation and for the sake of debating, or just for entertainment purposes, that leads to nowhere, because we're going to continue wanting to have a debate because we enjoy debates, instead of actually understanding better that the realities of what's happening and connecting to those people in order to bring those communities together towards peace. There's not many. I don't see any winners here from what's happening. The clear winner is the military complex in the U.S. that's selling all these weapons that are being used now to fight many wars, and probably maybe Pierce Morgan has won quite a bit from this.